Our gospel for today is from Matthew, verses 22, 34 to 46, continuing on from last week. But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees with his reply, they met together to question him again. One of them, an expert in religious law, tried to trap him with this question. Teacher, which is the most important commandment in the law of Moses? Jesus replied, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. That is the first and greatest commandment. A second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. The entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these two commandments. Then, surrounded by the Pharisees, Jesus asked them a question. What do you think about the Messiah? Whose son is he? They replied, he is the son of David. Jesus responded, then why does David, speaking under the inspiration of the Spirit, call the Messiah my Lord? For David said, the Lord said to my Lord, sit in the place of honor at my right hand until I humble your enemies beneath your feet. Since David called the Messiah my Lord, how can the Messiah be his son? No one could answer him, and after that, no one dared to ask him any more questions. I like that. They got tired of trying to trip him up. They got tired of trying to get him to say what they wanted to say to incriminate himself in some way. And they failed miserably. It's important to note that love the Lord your God and love your neighbor of yourself are both found in the Old Testament, one in Deuteronomy and one in Leviticus. And it's the foundation for everything. And so I'm going to switch over to Thessalonians because I'm kind of in a story mood today, or this created a story mood as I was trying to figure out how we can talk about these texts today. And so just a slight bit of history on Thessalonica. It was one of the largest and most important cities in the Macedonia area. Paul went there on his second missionary journey. After we had heard in the beginning there, he had had a rough time in Philippi. He and Silvanus or Silas and Timothy are writing the letter. And it was Paul and Silas who had been the ones to bring the good news to the people of Thessalonica. And Timothy had gone to check out and make sure that things were still going well there and was reporting back. There's some evidence that this might be the first letter that Paul ever wrote to any of the churches that he created. And he's writing it from Corinth, probably shortly after he had left in such a huff when things got difficult there. And so we come to this wonderful part of Paul just talking about his ministry in such a wonderful way. In some versions, it says like a nurse mothering children, and in my version, it says like a nursing mother taking care of her own children. And that really stuck with me. I love the idea of that nurturing, warm image that we get of a mother who gives of herself so that her child may grow and be healthy. So I'm going to share two stories now. This first one is from an NPR story about Stephanie Disney. She is an audiologist at the Commission for Children with Special Healthcare Needs. And it says she met her then 2.5-year-old daughter, Rudy. Disney recalls, my heart recognized her immediately. In the story, Disney says, I am the whitest of white women, and my daughter is some indefinable combination of all that is beautiful from at least 3 races. Curly, dark hair, petite features, freckles, a golden tan skin tone, and one blue eye and one brown. If her race had only one name, it would be perfection. I understand that everyone wants love and acceptance, and these are such rare gifts that when people see them freely demonstrated, they are compelled to seek the source. Recently, Rudy surprised me when a white-haired lady standing right beside us asked if I was her mother. Rudy threw the lady a disbelieving glance and said, "Well, she helps me with my multiplication, fixes my hair, kisses me, and we both have freckles on our noses. Who else could she be?" What love and tenderness. It is an amazing thing. I'm going to tell you the second story now, and they won't seem like they mesh together, but hopefully by the end of this, you will see that really in a lot of ways they're the same story. This is a story about missionaries that went down to Ecuador. The Aucas down there were a murderous tribe. It seemed that they loved to kill off each other in the various tribes around the way, and were actually heading towards extinction. So around September of 1955, a pilot named Nate Saint and four other missionaries, Jim Elliott, Ed McCully, Pete Fleming, and Roger Youderian, set up a camp in Ecuador, and they went to find the Aucas and bring the gospel message to them. They landed their plane on a little strip of sand by the river. They built a kind of tree fort to keep themselves safe. They had rifles with them, and they were attempting to reach out and connect with these people. In the process of this, in January of 1956, so not a whole lot of months later, they were drunk or whatever it was they got upset, and these tribesmen went after these 5 men. They didn't have time to get up in the treehouse. They had their guns, but they had decided beforehand that they knew where they were going. They knew where their final destination was, but that these tribes people were most likely going to hell because they didn't know Jesus. And so they shot above their heads, refusing to shoot, which ended up in them being speared to death. Now, one would think that the next part of the story would be about going and getting revenge or finding justice for these men. But what actually happened was that Rachel, Nate's sister, and Elizabeth Elliott, Jim Elliott's wife, ended up going and living with the Aucas. And over time, their love and their care and their lack of wanting revenge changed these people's lives. They came to know God, and it spread throughout the other tribes in the area. So these places where these people lived to murder and hurt others turned around and became loving and caring. So much so that Steve Saint, the son of Nate Saint, spent a lot of time growing up with them and was baptized by the 2 men that had murdered his father. It is an amazing story of love. It is an amazing story of what it means to share the gospel, to share the good news. In both these stories, the idea of loving is not about doing what seems right to people around you. I imagine there were probably some people that thought that Stephanie shouldn't have adopted Rudy. There were probably people that looked on her various ethnicities, wondering about her race, maybe the fact that her eyes were 2 different colors and looked down upon her and thought of her maybe as unadoptable. We don't know why her mother wasn't in the picture anymore. Maybe she abandoned her. Maybe she wasn't capable of looking after her. The story doesn't tell us what needs what her healthcare issues might have been. But I love Stephanie's statement about her race. If I could describe her race, I would describe it as perfection. Where other people saw imperfections, she saw perfection. And isn't that what God does for us? Isn't that what the good news is about? That no matter what we look like, we are loved. Those missionaries that went to Ecuador, people probably thought that they were crazy, allowing themselves basically to be killed instead of defending themselves. But they were there to share the gospel, not do what people normally do. They were there to share the gospel, to share the good news. And we can see that it wasn't easy. Stephanie spent a lot of time trying to deal with people asking what race Rudy was, because that's also important, right? And she went through a whole process of deciding how to talk about it, how to share it, to ignore it, to come back with a mean comeback, or to use it to try and help people understand that it's not about race, that it's about the person. To let people know that love comes in all shapes and sizes and combinations. Sometimes we get so tied up in what is right and what is wrong. We get caught up in those rules. And we think that good news has to be presented in a certain way. That maybe the way that the missionaries handled the Aquas and the Wadani tribe was not the best way. That somebody should have gone in and told them how they had to behave, who forced them to act like Christians elsewhere. But that's not what these women did. That's not what these men did. They opened up their hearts. They risked death, and death came for them. It is so easy for us to decide whether it's worth the cost or not to us. For Stephanie, it was just emotional. The cost for her was just emotional, that the way they treat or think about her daughter. But she didn't let that influence. She didn't let that change how she thought about her daughter and how much she loved her daughter, because Rudy had no doubt that this was her mother, that this person believed in her and loved her like nobody else could. For those missionaries, it cost their lives. For those women that went there, it was potentially their lives too. Their futures were turned around. I'm sure there was many women and other people who didn't understand how you can love somebody who takes the life of your mate. But that's part of what sharing the good news is, not worrying about the price that you may have to pay. In verse 4 of 1 Thessalonians, Paul reminds us, just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, not to please man, but to please God who tests our hearts. They were there not for flattery, not for greed. They were one of the few apostles who didn't ask to be paid. They took care of themselves. They tried to put no burden on the others. It speaks a lot of their character. What kind of people do we need to be? And no, none of us are perfect. We would all like to be completely selfless, always giving. But hopefully, in those moments and those times when God speaks to our soul, as it did to Stephanie's when she saw Rudy, we will give over to that whisper, that we will let go of our busy needs, our desires, or what we think is right and wrong, and we will give ourselves to that moment when loving and caring for another could mean the difference of life for the other. Our job, once we know how much God loves us, is to show that to the world. We want to please God. We want to tell the world that, hey, I'm God's. Can't you tell? And hopefully they can. We are called to nurture. I love that nursing mother taking care of her own image. That softness, that tenderness that can be difficult for some of us is a characteristic that it's good to develop, because sometimes people just need to know, need to be nurtured, need to be loved. And as with Stephanie and the Aukas, it wasn't a quick trip and a quick goodbye. When we want others to know about Jesus, we have to invest our time. I don't think there's really even a finish line, especially for those of parents. Whether you've lost a child or not, you're still always a parent. There is still always that sense that you are that caring, loving person. And if they were here, that's exactly what you would be doing. So there is no finish line. When we build relationships, there's a sense that they last. Paul had to leave. He was getting beat up and abused. He had to go for the sake of the church. But he wrote to them. We know he wrote to them at least twice. We don't know if he visited more or wrote more. These are all that we have. But for him, you are continually in our prayers. You are always on our hearts. You are always like that child to us that we want to nurture and love to fullness. Disney and the men in Ecuador placed their faith in God and went all in, loving and caring, willing to give of themselves even unto death. To love our neighbor as ourselves is not always easy, especially when we have to admit that sometimes we don't even love ourselves. But we can remember that God loved us before we loved us and before we loved him. We give back such a small portion of that love when we love others to God. We make that love real when we learn to love others, no matter the cost.